We will now move on to the approach of the banking regulator to fintechs. And to speak on this topic, we have Dr. Luís Barroso. Dr. Luís Barroso holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and currently works in the Legal Services Department in the Banco de Portugal, which is the Portuguese bank regulator. He is also a visiting professor at the Faculty of Law of Católica University. Welcome, Dr. Luís Barroso, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Catarina. First of all, so thank you very much to the organizers, Professor Dário Moura Vicente, Diogo Pereira Duarte, and Catarina Granadeiro. It's a privilege and an honor to be with you, and I'm very much enjoying the conference, and also I'm sure the rest of the conference as well. I must make a disclaimer, and I'm sorry, because in a way it's my fault that the title is presented in this way in the presentation, but I'm not representing Banco de Portugal institutionally. I don't have the condition of being also a board member, for sure, of my institution. I'm, a modest lawyer working there, and I will, of course, try to build on stances that are conveyed by Banco de Portugal and by the ECB, which, of course, matters in this regard, to highlight the approach of the banking regulator, and that's sort of where I come from. But the fact that I'm also not representing, I'm speaking on my own behalf, also allows me, perhaps, hopefully that can be a little bit also interesting, to elaborate a little bit more, with a little bit more freedom on my thoughts on some of the issues that are analyzed here. So, having said that, the first point I wanted to make is that although, of course, the word fintech is sticky and is really with us, and it's a fashionable word, we can say. It also attracts participants to conferences. I mean, we should recognize, I believe, as lawyers, we have this concern with the clarity of concepts, that it's a very fluid and open concept. Even if we read the definition that you correctly state here, the Financial Stability Board, which talks about technologically enabled financial innovation that could result in new business models, applications, processes, or products with an associated material effect. It's not, of course, we can see what material effect implies on financial markets and institutions on the provision of financial services. So it's a very open definition, and I say that because I think that there is sometimes a little bit of a risk that we say we should do this and that about fintech, but in fact we are talking about very different things. I'm not going to try and systematize the concept. There are many dimensions. I find it based on the current regulation, and not going, for example, so much into the aspect of the crypto assets, which is also very important, that I find that there are at least three parts to the concept that are relevant. One is when we talk about models, business models, which, although they fit in the current definitions of activity of institutions, so they do not challenge the regulation as we know it today. In fact, they use the regulation as we know it to make particular changes in the way that the products are supplied, or even in the concept of the business itself, that sort of challenges the traditional concepts on the basis which we have operated in. And that sometimes creates new risks. It may be risks of more prudential nature or risks more to the consumer, and we find that in our work, that this happens, and it challenges us because, of course, it's not that we cannot find sort of a room for them regulatorily, but that they create new challenges. Another one is when there are changes in the type of relationship that companies, banks, and other institutions have vis-à-vis their clients. So, for example, it's increasing use of online platforms, depersonalization. These kind of changes are also often referred as fintech. And also, people often refer to fintech to institutions which make greater reliance on IT. They outsource more, they use more IT platforms, they make greater use of artificial intelligence, or they are very reliant on regulatory technology. And so all of this just shows us that we're talking about quite different things. And a word of caution that while of course we should be open to innovation, and that's not, I'm not trying to at all change that. The point is just a word of caution that sometimes these words, because they also have some stickiness and some attractiveness to that, can be used to make suggestions for regulatory legislative changes which are not necessarily always good. And we should always think, is there a good reason to change our approach? Or is that just, you know, are we just sort of using concepts or new concepts to sort of describe similar things as we already have today? The second point or theme that I would like to quickly address concerns issue of regulation, and picking up on this point that's mentioned in the presentation that we have also for us today, which is the difference between activity-based and entity-based licensing. I was looking into the ECB response to the European Commission's Fintech Action Plan. And one of the things that the ECB notes, of course, is that because we have regulation that is in the EU, which is based on entities, essentially credit institutions, payment institutions, electronic money institutions, and so on, often what happens is that firms that have essentially similar or often similar activities are subject to different regulations. For example, a credit institution which is not very reliant on deposits and is very active in the payment market, of course, will be subject to different rules than a payment institution. And the ECB notes that there's an issue of level playing field that should be kept in mind in that regard. I would say, trying also to discuss this topic, that also not repeating also all the concepts that have been raised today, that I think we can see the authorization as a fundamental, critical and identity defining moment for the institutions and for the relationship between institutions, supervised institutions and the supervisors. What I mean by that is that the focus on the entity is very important because it allows not just the institutions from the beginning to clearly establish what they do and who they are, but also the supervisors to have clarity about that, and to know, and also the public in general, to know who they are dealing with and what they do. This has a number of advantages in terms of clarity, stabilization of the expectations, also the fact that we have establishing this identity from the beginning also prevents multiple types of entities based on different activities, because of course the same entity, credit institution just being an example, can perform multiple activities. So in that way, I'm just trying to say that there's also an advantage in this model that we have today, I find, in the sense that it puts pressure on institutions to define from the beginning what their business model, what they do, and also the supervisors do not have, although an authorization can be changed, of course, through another process, the supervisors do not have to go to be constantly adapting to changes in identity, let's say, of the institution, because suddenly some activity, some other activity is being performed. And in terms of even division of labor between the supervised entities and the supervisors, it seems to me that this model is much more suitable, I find, even though we, of course, have this issue that the ECB draws attention to, that the level playing field sometimes can be a challenge in the model that we currently have. So just to conclude this part, perhaps we can have some tweaks in the legislation to ensure that level playing field is preserved, but I do not see that fundamentally changing the entity-based authorization model that we have today would be a good way forward. The last point, the last theme is on the supervisory approach. So if we look at if we take, I'm talking about the ECB also because this now also, then of course also inspires Portugal's approach as a banking supervisor. If we look at the ECB's guide on the license applications for fintechs, one of the interesting things I find is that perhaps because the concept of fintech is fluid and it's not so clear exactly what we mean, in fact the guide is not so different from the guide that generally banks have to follow in terms of internal governance, in terms of management, in terms of the risks that they have to control and that they have to show to the supervisors that they are adequately managing. There are, of course, some specificities. So, for example, it's clear that so-called Fintech that is submitting an authorization is going to have to show that its internal controls as regards things like cyber risk, outsourcing arrangements, if there is a strong reliance on external technical infrastructure providers such as cloud services, for example, that these things are adequately tackled and managed. The management board needs to have adequate IT knowledge and experience. Because artificial intelligence tools may be used as regards, for example, credit scoring and these things, it's important that there are adequate controls for AI. This is also going to be affected, of course, by the new, if we do see it come to light, the new European Artificial Intelligence Act, and also regulatory technology, ensuring that that this technology that is used is suitable, that is adequate, and that the supervisor also has the capacities through supervisory technology to adequately control all this. So this part, it seems to me, is important in the sense that there are clearly very important challenges here as regards the increasing use of artificial intelligence, issues of the challenge that will also be for supervisors to keep the pace with developments in regulatory technology, which is going to challenge not just the technological capacity to adapt, but also the capacity to comply with legal principles that are involved when we resort to technology increasingly and we do our work more based on these tools than from a human-based perspective. And so to conclude, it doesn't seem to me, when we look at the regulatory aspects and the difference between entity-based and activity-based authorization, that's not perhaps where I see the main challenges, although, as I said, there are issues of level playing field, but the supervisory aspect concerning the capacity to be up to date with these developments and to have technological developments and to have a proper legal background, since we also, many of you here, I guess, lawyers, to have proper legal capacity to adapt to this increasing use of technology, in particular from an administrative law perspective. This part is very important and we have to pay very close attention to it. Thank you very much.